Okay, so this is going to be a brief video overview to help us prepare to discuss our readings on psychoanalytic film theory this week. So just to introduce some of the concepts that will play into how all this comes out, we need to start thinking about semiotics, okay? So this comes out of structuralism. It stems from linguistic theory. Basically, semiotics and semiology, it's the study of signs, okay? Um, your reading talks about this a little bit, but the basic idea is that you need to understand language as a system in linguistic theory. And so it's concerned with meaning that is generated through that system, right? And it's not necessarily concerned with the fixed meanings of individual words and syllables. So in terms of cinema, right, it's not so much concerned with, you know, the basic plot structure, although that is also something that can be analyzed, and it's not necessarily concerned with any particular piece of the frame as is, but how all of those things in conjunction with one another create meaning. So there are three types of signs in semiology. The iconic, this is something that resembles the object. So if we see a photograph of a tree, we know that that's a tree. It's indexical is the second type. Now this indicates the presence of that object. So a photograph of a tree, right, even if it's not directly in front of a real tree, we can infer that the tree was there when the photograph was taken, okay? Another way to think of this might be a footprint. Okay, a footprint indicates that the foot was there, but it's not the foot itself. That would be the iconic sign, right? The last one is symbolic. Now, the symbolic sign has a learned meaning. Okay, it's arbitrary. Okay, it can be something like in the video we watched this week. To explain this, the play symbol on a video. Okay, the arrow doesn't mean anything other than arrow, and yet we know if it's on a remote or it's on a video online and we click it, that will play the thing that we want played. Okay, so that's the very brief overview here. Now, our reading this week was Peter Wolin, and we'll talk more about Wolin in class, but here's what he's doing. Okay, so in Signs and Meaning the Cinema, he's working through semiotic theory and applying it to the analysis of film. The idea here is that film itself is a semiotic system filled with the iconic, indexical, and symbolic meanings. And for Wolin, because he's thinking about aesthetics and specifically comparative aesthetics and general theories of signification, kind of coming out of art theory as well as linguistic theory, he's primarily concerned with the symbolic meaning of these images. Okay, even though we might think about and analyze the other types of signs as well. So if you remember, earlier film theorists were very fond of discussing cinema's indexicality as a mode of understanding its relation to reality, right? So thinking about realism. They weren't using semiotics to do that necessarily. But the idea here is that you can use these other types of signs to interpret cinema. So again, just to reiterate, he's trying to bring an aesthetic study to the cinema, to study the cinema as a system of signs that is meant to be interpreted or can be interpreted. Okay. Now, this ties directly into kind of psychoanalytic theory and what it's trying to do, although they're not exactly the same, right? One is a linguistic theory and one is a psychological theory. Okay. So basically this week is all about reading movies and analyzing movies. And they're thinking through, each theorist, how do we do this? How does the film indicate to us how to interpret it? Okay. So what is psychoanalysis? All right. Some of you may have had philosophy or psychology classes where you study psychoanalytic theory. Basically, what we're concerned with is psychoanalysis as an investigation of the interactions between the conscious and unconscious areas of the mind. So as something that studies and brings out the repressed elements and fears into our consciousness so that they may be dealt with. Okay, that's what psychoanalysis does. It's a form of therapy, right? That analyzes our dreams, tries to make sense of our relationships, of our repressed memories. And there are certain key theories, particularly from Freudian and Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, that underpin a lot of what we'll be talking about moving forward in this class. So some of these things are the interpretation of dreams, the Oedipal complex, the idea of castration and lack and fear caused by that, as well as constructions of the ego, superego, and the id. Now, all of this is bound up in psychoanalytic theory. What the two theorists we're reading today for class are doing this week is thinking through how cinema is like psychoanalysis, in that we identify with, and it allows us to work through certain repressions and represents those things, right? So this is how it ties into semiology, right? It's the symbolic order that we're thinking of here, okay? So very briefly, and we'll talk much more about this in class, Beaudry's theory is predicated in some ways on similar things to what Metz is talking about. We'll talk about the mirror phase, but the idea for Beaudry is that he's thinking about cinema and our consciousness as a related apparatus. This is something called apparatus theory. Okay, so that cinema becomes a very powerful machine which transforms the embodied, socially situated individual into a spectatorial subject. So that the cinema for Beaudry constitutes the approximate material realization of an unconscious goal, perhaps inherent in the human psyche. The regressive desire to return to an earlier state of psychic development, a state of relative narcissism in which desire could be satisfied through a simulated, enveloping reality where the separation between ego and non-ego is not clearly defined. Okay, so he's thinking through here how cinema creates a situation for us to be lulled into identifying with and kind of dreaming with the cinema. Okay, and because we're doing that, we can interpret the cinema in some way as a dream, as a symbolic object. Okay, we don't necessarily identify ourselves, but we identify ourselves as a subject that is directly related to the cinema. Now, Metz takes this a step further. We'll get to him in just a second. But in class this week, I want us to be able to talk about how Beaudry says this works. So what is exactly the apparatus part of this theory? How does he break this down? Okay, so come ready to talk about that. All right. Finally, Christian Metz and the imaginary signifier. Now, I know that this essay is very dense, and it's with reason. What he's doing is trying to understand how cinema relates to pleasure, okay? How we derive pleasure from watching the cinema, no matter what it is we're being shown, how we identify with the film as both the subject and the object of the film, and how we can interpret the cinema using these tools. Okay. Now, what he's doing in his essay is going bit by bit through different parts of psychoanalytic theory and talking about how the cinema relates directly to those things. A key part of this for him is the mirror stage, which comes from Freud, but is really a Lacanian bit of psychoanalytic theory that we will cover much more in depth in class. So really come ready to talk about that part of it. But just to kind of briefly get us to a point here, right? He wants to know how we relate, understand how we relate. So if something that is possibly objectionable, for example, right? Why are we interested in seeing it? Well, for example, disaster films or horror films play with our worst fears, but are often massive box office hits. Okay. And this is because they perform a psychoanalysis on us. They soothe us because we experience them as us, but also not as us, right? This is the importance of the mirror stage here, right? We can enjoy and find pleasure in watching horror or disaster movies because they do perform modes of psychoanalytic therapy on us in some way, right? And that's how we can also understand and interpret what's going on in the cinema. Now, this gets much more complex than that, right? So we might take pure pleasure, right? We might like comedies, we might like romantic comedies, we might genuinely like all kinds of stuff. But we can also call all of that stuff into question. Now, where this goes is things like feminist theory, queer theory, and race theory, right? So we're thinking through theories of identification and abjection or distancing. And a key part of what we're going to really be diving into over the next couple of weeks is this idea that cinema generates pleasure for us, and we're going to be understanding the systems of that, as well as understanding kind of our own positions in relation to the cinema as viewers. Okay. And that's where all of this theory starts to go. This is very much no longer classical film theory, which we've spent a significant portion of the course so far dealing with. This is all new. It's 1960s and 70s forward. This is the real shift in film theory right here. So come to class ready to talk about that, ready to talk about Rear Window, the Hitchcock film we watched this week. We'll be watching the same film next week for Laura Mulvey's essay, which once you read that, you will really see, oh, this is where kind of the study of semiotics and the study of psychoanalytic theory really starts to hit the road and take us somewhere. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in class this week.